The number that appears. When your life is quietly coming together, you keep noticing it. A receipt, a clock, a page number you were not even looking for. Some days it shows up 3 or 4 times before noon, and you cannot explain why. At first you called it a coincidence. Then you called it a habit of your eyes. Then you stopped mentioning it out loud, because it sounded strange to say. Here is the answer, stated plainly. No waiting required. This number shows up when your life is quietly assembling itself into the right order, after a long stretch of feeling scattered. It does not mean something is wrong. It means pieces that used to work against each other are finally starting to line up. That is the surface layer, and it is already true. Underneath it are 3 more layers, and the last one explains why this always happens right before something changes for good in your life. The order you did not ask for. For a while, nothing about your life looked organized. Plans fell through and rearranged themselves without asking you first. Relationships shifted. Work changed shape. You kept adjusting, because adjusting was the only thing you knew how to do. Then the numbers started showing up, quietly at first, on a dashboard, in a total at checkout, on the corner of a document you opened for an unrelated reason. You noticed it the way you notice a draft coming through a window, before you can name where it started. You did not go looking for this, and that matters. Signs that arrive uninvited carry a different weight than the ones you chase. You were not manifesting, not meditating on it, not scrolling for meaning. You were just living your life, and it kept finding you anyway. Here is where most people get stuck. They try to force the sign into one dramatic meaning, something that explains everything at once. But order does not usually arrive as a lightning strike. It arrives the way a room gets clean, one surface at a time, until you look up and realize the whole space finally makes sense. Think about the last few months honestly. A conversation that used to circle back to the same fight, and now it does not. A decision you used to postpone, made without the usual dread. A version of your schedule that finally has room to breathe. None of these felt like a turning point while they were happening, and that is exactly the point. And here is the detail almost nobody explains about this stage. The reason it feels so undramatic is because your nervous system is calibrated for threat, not for steady improvement. You are wired to notice the fire, not the slow, careful rebuilding that happens after it. So the very sign meant to reassure you can feel almost too quiet to trust at first. That quietness is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. Real order rarely announces itself with noise. It moves in the background, arranging small things correctly, long before it lets you see the whole shape of what it built. You are allowed to notice this pattern without fully understanding it yet. Understanding comes next. Right now, all you need to know is that the sign is real. It is early, and it is telling you something specific about the exact order forming underneath the surface of your days. There is also a kind of relief hidden inside this recognition, even before you understand the mechanism behind it. For a long time you may have suspected that the effort you kept putting in was going nowhere, that the adjusting and readjusting was just survival with no real direction attached to it. This early stage is your first honest evidence against that suspicion. Something is accumulating. You are simply catching it at the point where it has just crossed from invisible into barely visible, which is exactly why it still feels this fragile and this easy to dismiss. Do not rush past that fragility to get to a bigger answer. Sit with it for a moment. The fact that you noticed it all, rather than letting the sign slide past you unrecognized, is itself a signal that something in you has changed enough to be paying attention differently than before. What 1234 actually means. The number is 1234. Say it slowly and notice what your eyes do. They move forward, in order, without skipping a beat. That is not decoration. That is the entire meaning compressed into 4 digits. Most repeating numbers ask you to hold 2 ideas together, a balance, a mirror, a pair. This one is different. It only moves one direction. It builds. Each digit depends on the one before it, and none of them can be rearranged without breaking the sequence. When this pattern starts appearing around you, it is showing you the shape of your own progress, laid out plainly, one correct step after another. In numerology, sequential numbers are read as evidence of structure completing itself, not chaos resolving by luck, but structure, the kind that was already being built while you were too tired or too busy to notice it happening. You were laying groundwork during the months that felt like nothing. This number is the receipt for that work. Here is the detail that changes how most people read this sign. They assume order means the hard part is over. It rarely does. What 1234 actually confirms is that the foundation is finally load-bearing. The next steps will be easier to take, not because the effort disappears, but because you are no longer building on unstable ground. Think about a staircase under construction. For a long time it looks like scaffolding and noise, and you cannot walk on any of it. Then one day quietly, the steps are solid enough to hold your weight and you climb without thinking twice. Nobody rings a bell when that shift happens. You simply notice you are standing higher than before. That is what this number is marking. Not an ending and not a miracle. A structural fact about your life that has become true while you were focused elsewhere. It also helps to understand why sequential numbers specifically carry this meaning across so many numerology traditions, rather than any random string of digits. Order that builds in one direction, without reversal, has always been read as a symbol of momentum that will hold. Numbers that repeat a single digit, by contrast, are usually read as intensity or emphasis, a spotlight on one theme. This number is different. It is not asking you to focus harder on one idea. It is showing you a direction, confirming that the steps already taken are compounding correctly, instead of canceling each other out the way effort sometimes does during unstable periods. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A spotlight tells you where to look. A sequence tells you where you are going. You have been receiving direction, not just attention. The remaining question is why your mind keeps catching this particular sequence instead of ignoring it like it ignores most numbers around you. That answer belongs to the next layer. Why small steps feel like nothing until they are not. There is a particular kind of disappointment that comes from doing the right thing and feeling nothing happen. You set the boundary. You kept the routine. You made the call you had been avoiding. And the next morning, life looked almost exactly the same. This is where most people quit, not because the work failed, but because progress at this stage is nearly invisible. Small corrections do not announce themselves. They accumulate underneath the surface, in places you cannot check the way you check a bank balance. Psychologists who study behavior change describe this as the plateau phase. Effort goes in consistently, but the visible result lags far behind it. The gap between action and evidence is where most transformation quietly dies, abandoned by people who assumed nothing was working. You are not in that group. You kept going through the plateau, and 1234 is the marker that tells you the lag has ended. The effort you already spent is now becoming visible, one correctly placed piece at a time, in the exact order you actually did the work. Here's what almost nobody tells you about this stage. The steps do not feel meaningful while you are taking them, because your brain is optimized to notice change, not steadiness. A single dramatic event registers instantly. 100 small corrections barely register at all, even though the 100 small corrections are what actually rebuild a life. Think about learning to walk again after an injury. Nobody remembers the individual physical therapy sessions. They remember the day they walked across a room without thinking about it. But that day only existed because of every unremarkable session before it, stacked in order, each one depending on the last. That is the mechanism behind this number. It is not telling you something new is starting. It is confirming that everything you already did is finally stacking correctly. There is a second reason the plateau feels so discouraging, and it rarely gets named clearly. Effort and reward operate on different clocks. You spend the effort in real time, day by day, feeling every ounce of it. The reward compounds silently, off to the side, until it crosses a threshold you cannot see coming in advance. This mismatch is not a flaw in you. It is simply how compounding works in finances, in fitness, and in the quieter architecture of a rebuilt life. Once you understand that mismatch, the plateau stops feeling like proof of failure and starts feeling like exactly what it is, a normal and necessary stretch where the work is real, but not yet visible. You were never behind schedule. You were on the only schedule that produces results built to last. And there is a reason your particular timeline mattered more than the size of any single step you took, a reason that goes deeper than patience. The myth of the big turning point. Most of us were taught to expect transformation as an event, a diagnosis, a breakup, a single conversation that changes everything in one afternoon. Movies are built around this moment, so we start looking for it in our own lives, and we measure our progress against it. But real change rarely works that way. It works the way 1234 works, sequentially, one dependent step after another, with no single moment carrying the entire weight of the outcome. If you are waiting for the cinematic turning point before you believe anything has shifted, you may miss the shift entirely, because it already happened in installments. Consider what actually preceded whatever recent stability you're noticing. It was probably not one decision. It was a string of smaller ones made across weeks or months, each one slightly less reactive than the last. You forgave something without announcing it. You left a room instead of arguing in it. You said no to a version of your week that used to feel mandatory. None of those moments looked like a turning point from the inside. They looked like maintenance. That is exactly why they worked. Maintenance compounds. Drama does not. Here is the part that reframes almost everyone's experience of this number. People expect it to arrive at the finish line as a reward for arriving. It rarely does. It shows up in the middle of the sequence while you are still climbing, as confirmation that the climb is real and correctly ordered, not as proof that you have already reached the top. This is the detail that separates people who trust the sign from people who dismiss it. The ones who trust it keep taking the next small, undramatic step, because they understand the step is the point. The ones who dismiss it keep waiting for a bigger sign, and in doing so, they overlook the very structure already forming underneath them. You are not behind, because your progress felt quiet. Quiet progress and real progress are frequently the same thing wearing different clothing. There is a cultural reason this myth persists so stubbornly, beyond the movies. Stories need a compressed timeline to hold attention, so writers collapse months of undramatic effort into a single scene. We absorb that structure so completely that we start applying it to our own lives without realizing how distorted the comparison is. A 2-hour film has to fake momentum. Your life does not owe anyone that shortcut, and expecting it from yourself sets an unreasonable standard that almost nobody could meet. Once you stop measuring your progress against a fictional pace, the sequence behind 1234 becomes much easier to trust. It was never supposed to feel like a movie. It was always going to feel like maintenance, quietly compounding, and the next layer explains exactly why your mind is built to miss that overlap between quiet and real. Your mind was built to find this pattern. Carl Jung called it synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that carries emotional weight even though it cannot be explained through direct cause and effect. He did not mean magic. He meant that the psyche and the outside world sometimes arrange themselves along the same axis at the same time, and the overlap feels significant because it is significant to the person noticing it. Your brain is a pattern recognition system before it is anything else. It survived by catching sequences in noise, footsteps in grass, a shift in a familiar voice, a number that keeps repeating when your internal state is already primed to notice order. This is not superstition. It is neurology doing exactly what it evolved to do. Here is why this particular pattern is catching your attention now and not 2 years ago. 2 years ago, your internal state may have been too chaotic to register sequential order as significant. Your nervous system was scanning for threat, not for structure. Structure does not register as urgent when survival feels uncertain. But once a baseline of stability returns, even a fragile one, your attention shifts toward organizing signals. And 1234 is exactly that kind of signal. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly. You are not imagining a pattern that is not there. You are finally calm enough to notice a pattern that was always available to notice. The number did not start appearing more often. Your capacity to register it did. Think of it like walking into a quiet room after leaving a loud one. For the first few minutes, the silence itself feels strange, almost suspicious. Then your ears adjust and you start hearing details that were always present. A clock, a hum, a breath. The room did not change. Your listening did. That shift in listening is what synchronicity theory is actually describing. Meaning was not injected into the world from outside. Your readiness to perceive existing structure increased. Jung also observed that these meaningful coincidences tend to cluster around genuine psychological transitions, not around ordinary stretches of daily life. That clustering is not accidental. A transition puts the psyche into a heightened, searching state, more attentive to symbol and pattern than usual. Part of you is actively looking for confirmation that the transition is real and safe to continue. Sequential numbers, with their clean forward motion, answer that search almost perfectly, which is part of why they feel so specifically reassuring compared to numbers with no inherent direction to them. None of this makes the experience less spiritually meaningful. Psychology explaining a mechanism does not remove the significance of what the mechanism reveals about you. 1234 is the structure your particular life keeps handing you to notice, in the exact order your mind is finally steady enough to read correctly. The coincidence that keeps a schedule. If this were pure randomness, the timing would be flat. You would notice the number roughly as often during calm weeks as during difficult ones. But that is not what most people report. The sightings cluster, appearing in bursts right before a decision, right after a conversation that mattered, right at the edge of a change you had not fully named yet. That clustering is the detail worth sitting with. Randomness does not organize itself around your internal timeline. Attention does. And attention, it turns out, is not evenly distributed across your day either. It spikes at moments of emotional significance, which means the number is more likely to register precisely when your life is doing something worth registering. This does not make the experience less meaningful. It makes it more precise. The sightings are not scattered evidence of a vague cosmic message. They are a live index of the moments your own psyche has flagged as important, showing up in a form specific enough to be undeniable and open enough to require your own interpretation. Here is the part most explanations skip entirely. The schedule follows a real pattern, but it is also not externally imposed on you. You are, in a very real sense, the one keeping it. Your attention decides when the pattern becomes visible. The number was probably present in some form throughout the difficult stretch too, but you were not in a state to catch it. Think about a radio tuned slightly off a station. The song is technically transmitting the entire time, underneath the static. You only hear it clearly once the dial lands correctly. Nothing about the broadcast changed. Your receiver did. Your receiver has been changing for a while now, quietly, through every small correction covered in earlier chapters. 1234 is not choosing when to visit you. There is a practical way to test this for yourself, without any special tools. Look back at the weeks when the sightings felt most frequent, and compare them honestly against what was happening in your life at the time. You will likely find they cluster around decisions, not around ordinary Tuesdays. A choice about a relationship, a choice about your work, a choice about whether to keep believing something was improving at all. The number was not distributed evenly across the calendar. It was distributed around the exact moments your attention needed confirmation the most. That pattern is not proof of a cosmic scheduling system tracking you individually. It is proof that your own psychology has been keeping remarkably good time, flagging significance the instant significance actually occurred. You are finally tuned to a frequency where its structure comes through clean instead of scattered, and the next layer explains what you actually lose in exchange for that clarity. What you lose when chaos finally leaves. Nobody prepares you for this part. You spend so long wanting stability that you assume its arrival will feel like pure relief. Often it feels like grief instead, quiet and confusing, arriving right alongside the very order you asked for. Chaos, for all its damage, gave you a job. It kept you alert, reactive, needed, constantly solving something. That role becomes an identity if it lasts long enough. When the fires stop, the identity built around fighting them does not disappear immediately. It lingers, looking for something to manage, even after the managing is no longer necessary. This is why some people quietly sabotage stability right after they achieve it. Not because they want to fail. A calm life can feel unfamiliar in the body, almost unearned. The nervous system will sometimes manufacture a new crisis, just to return to a state it recognizes. If you have felt a strange flatness lately alongside genuine progress, this is likely why. You are not ungrateful. You are recalibrating an identity that spent years defined by problems. And that recalibration takes real time, even after the external circumstances have already improved. Here is the detail that reframes this discomfort. The flatness is not evidence that the progress is fake. It is evidence that the progress is real enough to require a new self to hold it. You cannot bring the version of you built for survival into a life that no longer requires surviving. Something has to be released for the new order to actually settle. Think of a hand that has been clenched for years finally opening. The fingers do not relax instantly. They ache first, from the release itself, before they remember how to rest. That ache is not a setback. It is the muscle unlearning its own defense. You are in that ache right now, and 1234 is confirming that the hand is, in fact, opening correctly, even though opening rarely feels like the relief people expect it to feel like at first. Grief for a version of yourself you no longer need is still grief, and it deserves to be named honestly instead of pushed past. You can miss the sharpness of who you were during the difficult years, even while being genuinely relieved those years are ending. Both feelings are allowed to sit in the same body at the same time. Neither one cancels the other out. What helps most here is not forcing the grief to resolve quickly. It resolves on its own timeline, the same way everything else in this sequence has, one small release at a time. You do not have to perform gratitude for the calm before you actually feel it. You only have to keep letting the clenched hand open, a little further each week without demanding that it stop aching before it is ready to. The architecture nobody sees you building. Every stable structure has a part that stays hidden once it is finished. A foundation gets covered by the floor built on top of it. Wiring disappears behind a wall the moment the wall goes up. You never see the load-bearing work again, even though everything above it depends on it holding. Your recent life has followed the same logic. Think of the hardest structural work you did, the boundary you finally held, the story about yourself you finally stopped repeating, the relationship you finally let end correctly instead of dragging it out. None of that stays visible once it is finished. It gets covered by the next ordinary day and the next one after that. This is why people around you may not fully register how much has changed. They see the current floor, not the foundation underneath it. That is not dismissal. It is simply how architecture works. The work that mattered most is often the work nobody gets to witness directly. Here is the detail worth naming clearly. You do not need external witnesses for the structure to be real. A foundation does not require an audience to hold weight. It only needs to be sound. 1234 functions as your own private confirmation, visible to you specifically, that the load-bearing decisions actually held. Think about a bridge under construction. For most of the process, it looks unfinished and slightly precarious, cables exposed, support still being welded into place. Then one day the surface gets laid down, and from that point forward, everyone who crosses it experiences only the smooth part, unaware of the structural decisions that made the smoothness possible. You built the exposed, precarious part. You are the only one who watched every weld happen. And now the number is arriving to mark the moment the surface goes down, quietly, without applause, exactly as most real architecture does. This is also why comparing your life to someone else's rarely gives you an accurate read on your own progress. You are comparing your exposed scaffolding to their finished surface, because their foundation work already disappeared from view months or years ago. It is not a fair comparison, and it never was. Everyone crossing a bridge only sees the version that already holds weight. Almost nobody gets shown the welding. The next layer looks at how you begin recognizing yourself as the person who did this building, instead of the person who was simply waiting for it to happen. That recognition is its own kind of foundation, quieter than the first one, but every bit as load-bearing. The quiet difference between waiting and assembling. There is a version of stillness that looks identical from the outside, but feels completely different from the inside, depending on which one you are actually living. Waiting is passive. It hands the outcome to circumstance and hopes something external arrives to fix things. Assembling is active. It keeps placing small pieces correctly, even without proof that the whole picture will ever come together. For most of your life, these two states probably blurred together. You told yourself you were building something while underneath you were actually waiting for permission, for rescue, for a sign that never quite felt convincing enough to act on. That confusion is common, and it is not a character flaw. Nobody teaches the difference explicitly. Here's how you tell them apart in hindsight, looking back at your own recent months. Waiting produces the same day repeated with minor variation. Assembling produces a sequence each week slightly different from the last, moving in one traceable direction, even when no single week felt dramatic. If you trace your last several months honestly, you will likely find a sequence, not a repetition. That sequence is the very thing 1234 is confirming exists. Not a wish fulfilled from outside, but a structure you assembled, piece by piece, often without realizing you had crossed from waiting into building. There is a specific moment where this shift usually happens and almost nobody notices it in real time. It is the first time you make a decision based on where you are actually heading, instead of what you are trying to avoid. That single decision rarely feels significant, but it marks the exact point where assembling replaced waiting, and everything sequenced after it depends on that pivot. Think of a puzzle with no reference image. Early pieces feel meaningless because there is nothing to compare them against. But once enough pieces connect, a shape starts to emerge on its own, and suddenly every remaining piece has an obvious place. You are past that early meaningless stage now. The shape is emerging, and it emerged because you kept placing pieces during the exact months it looked like nothing was forming at all. There is a quiet kind of confidence available at this stage, different from the confidence people usually talk about. It does not come from certainty about the future. You still do not know exactly how every remaining piece will fit. It comes instead from trusting your own hands to keep placing pieces correctly, regardless of how the full picture eventually turns out. That is a sturdier confidence than certainty ever was, because it does not collapse the moment circumstances shift again. Notice too how differently effort feels once you know you are assembling rather than waiting. The same task, done from a builder's mindset instead of a waiting mindset, requires less willpower to sustain. You are not gritting your teeth through delay anymore. You are simply continuing work you already know is under construction, one honest piece at a time. When you stop counting the steps. Early in any real rebuilding, people count obsessively. Days since the hard decision, weeks since the last setback. Small tallies that offer proof because proof feels necessary when trust in the process is still thin. Counting is not a flaw at this stage. It is a reasonable response to uncertainty. But counting has a natural endpoint, and most people miss the exact moment it arrives. It is not a dramatic milestone. It is simply the day you realize you forgot to keep track, not because you gave up caring, but because the outcome finally started to feel stable enough not to require constant verification. If you have noticed yourself checking less lately, worrying less about whether the progress will reverse, that is worth naming directly. It means your nervous system has begun trusting the sequence without needing you to supervise every step of it manually. That trust is not naive. It is earned, built from every previous step that actually held. Here is the part that surprises people the most about this stage. Once you stop counting, the sightings of 1234 often continue anyway, sometimes even increase for a short window. This is not the sign trying to regain your attention. It is confirmation arriving at a different purpose now, no longer proving the structure exists but simply marking that the structure has become part of your baseline reality instead of a fragile exception to it. Think about learning a language. In the beginning, you translate every sentence internally before speaking, counting words, checking grammar consciously. Fluency arrives quietly, the day you realize you have been speaking without translating for several minutes without noticing. Nobody rings a bell for that transition either. You simply catch yourself already inside it. You are catching yourself already inside a version of your life you used to have to force into place through constant effort. The forcing is largely finished now. It is worth naming what replaces the counting because the space it leaves behind does not stay empty for long. Attention that used to monitor for collapse becomes available for other things again. Creativity, rest, curiosity about what comes next instead of vigilance about what might go wrong. That redirected attention is one of the clearest, least talked about rewards of this entire process. Stability does not just remove a threat, it returns a resource that the threat had been quietly occupying the whole time. You may notice yourself picking up an old interest again, or having the mental space to plan further ahead than a single week. That is not a coincidence sitting beside the number. It is the direct result of counting finally stopping. And the final layer explains what actually stays true once it stops for good. Becoming the person who already arrived. There is a strange lag between circumstances changing and identity catching up to the change. You can be objectively stable for months while still privately operating from the anxious, scattered version of yourself that the earlier chaos required. The furniture of your life gets rearranged long before the person living inside it fully believes the rearrangement is real. This lag explains a lot of quiet discomfort people feel even after genuine progress. You keep bracing for a collapse that is not coming, because bracing was the correct response for so long that your body has not fully updated the manual. Vigilance outlives the threat it was built for. That is not weakness. It is simply how adaptation works, slower to release than it was to activate. Here is the detail that moves this process forward, faster than waiting for time alone to do it. Identity does not update primarily through insight. It updates through repeated evidence, small proof collected across ordinary days, that the new structure can be trusted without constant checking. Every time you make a decision from stability instead of fear, you hand your nervous system one more piece of that evidence. Every time 1234 appears and you recognize it calmly, instead of anxiously scanning for hidden meaning, that recognition itself becomes part of the proof. You are not just witnessing order. You are practicing being someone who trusts order, one small rehearsal at a time. Think about an actor who has played a steady, grounded character for so long that the steadiness starts showing up off stage too. The character was rehearsed first, deliberately, before it became natural. You have been rehearsing groundedness for months now, sometimes without noticing, through every boundary held and every reactive habit interrupted. You are close to the point where the rehearsal simply becomes who you are, without the ongoing sense of performing it. The number is not asking you to wait for that shift. It is telling you the shift is already substantially underway. There will still be moments that test the new identity before it fully settles. An old trigger will appear, and for a second you will brace the way you used to. That single second of bracing is not proof the old version has returned. It is a reflex finishing its exit, slower to fade than the circumstances that caused it. What matters is what you do in the second after the reflex fires, and increasingly, you are choosing differently there too. That choosing, repeated enough times, is the entire mechanism identity change runs on. Nothing more dramatic than that. Small, repeated, chosen differences, until the difference stops requiring choice and simply becomes how you already are. And the closing chapter shows what remains, once it fully completes. What comes full circle now. Return, for a moment, to the version of you who first started noticing this number. Scattered, unsure whether any of it meant anything. Quietly hoping for proof that the effort was not wasted, without being able to say that hope out loud to anyone. That person was not wrong to hope. They were simply early in a sequence they could not see the shape of yet. Every layer covered here was already forming underneath their days, whether or not they had the language for it at the time. 1234 was never a promise of an easy path. It was a receipt for a structural process, sequential, dependent on every earlier step holding correctly before the next one could exist. You did not receive this sign because your life became perfect. You received it because your life became ordered enough for order to be visible from the outside for the first time. Here is what actually completes now, and it is smaller and steadier than most people expect. Not a finish line, a baseline. The version of you who used to brace for collapse can finally rest, not because nothing will ever go wrong again, but because you now trust yourself to rebuild correctly if it does. That trust is the real structure this entire pattern was pointing toward. Everything now comes full circle. The scattered pieces from the opening of this video were never actually random. They were early components of exactly this order, arriving out of sequence at first, The way construction materials arrive before the building takes shape around them. You could not see the design from inside the mess. You can see it now. What remains is simple, though simple rarely means easy. Keep placing the next correct piece. Keep trusting the quiet, undramatic steps over the loud, dramatic ones. The number will likely keep appearing for a while longer, not as a test, but as confirmation, marking each new piece as it locks correctly into place. You already know how to do this. You have been doing it the entire time this video described. The order was never coming from outside you. It was coming from you, one honest step at a time, finally visible enough to count. Whatever brought you to this exact video, the tired mornings, the quiet hope, the number showing up one time too many to ignore, it led you here for a reason worth trusting. Not because a sign chose you specifically, but because you did the work that made the sign legible in the first place. That distinction matters more than it might seem. It means the credit belongs to you, not to luck. And it means the next sequence, whatever it turns out to be, is already within your reach. Carry that with you when you close this video and return to your ordinary day. The number may keep appearing for a while, or it may quiet down now that its message has landed. Either way, the structure it confirmed does not depend on continued sightings to remain true. It is already built. It is already yours. And it was built the exact way everything that lasts is built. Quietly, in order, one correct piece placed after another.